This episode of Dispatches from Planet Albany is brought to you with support by New York State United Teachers, which represents more than 600,000 educators and school-related professionals in New York. Dispatches is also supported by the public affairs firm O'Donnell & Associates. For more information, check out o'donnellsolutions.com.
Next from the 69th Assembly District is Micah Lasher.
I've also declared war on potholes, so here's the first shot across the bow.
Well, as you know, with Planet Albany, there's always something that makes the planet turn.
And it's this amazing view of D.C., and Eddie Vedder comes out. And he goes, "You have a cigarette?" And I've never smoked in my life, but if I had, I wish that was the moment.
And this strategy takes us from potholes to knotholes.
I would like to say it was a pleasure, Mr. Kim. But I'm on the road.
I'm David Lombardo, and this is Dispatches from Planet Albany, a podcast about power and politics in New York State government. On this episode, we're checking in with Assemblymember Micah Lasher before he trades in New York's capital for the nation's capital as he becomes the successor in Congress to Representative Jerry Nadler. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Before joining the Assembly, you served as a Director of Policy for the governor. What sort of mandate did you have in that job to bring your own ideas, and how much of it was simply about executing the principal's vision?
I think my first day was November 17th, 2021, with 7 weeks on the clock before the governor was set to deliver her first State of the State. And the biggest part of that job, the meat of it, was really to develop the annual State of the State agenda and to both solicit and elicit ideas from agencies and colleagues in the governor's office, to come up with ideas, to kind of organize all of that for discussion with the governor and be a sort of ringleader putting together an agenda that can then be articulated as part of the State of the State. And so it was really kind of an iterative process in the development of that agenda. I did 3 of them, and it was stressful. Working with the governor was awesome, and it was a great privilege.
But when you joined, the governor had only been the governor for about 2 months at that point. So I have to imagine you're starting with a lot of blank paper. And so did that mean you got to be very influential in shaping the direction, or maybe dumping in pet projects from your time working for Bloomberg or Schneiderman, or maybe in the private sector?
There was something both stressful and wonderful about being there in that foundational moment. I think it's one of the reasons that the governor and I were able to build a strong relationship. I think it's one of the reasons I built strong relations with my colleagues, because we were all there trying to sort of stand up this new government with, as you say, a lot of blank paper. And that's a real bonding experience. And that was definitely what we were all dealing with. I brought to that conversation certainly years spent in state and city government, ideas that I had heard over the years, things that had been tried but not accomplished, and that would come up from time to time. I remember early on in the governor's tenure, she wanted to do a package on gun safety, and I had worked on those issues. I had things that I had been involved with that had not succeeded that I was able to say to her, "Oh, this is something we could look at trying to revive." And, you know, in Albany, things take time. Oftentimes, good ideas fail on the first go-round, the second go-round. And so certainly there was an opportunity to bring back some ideas that had not gotten over the line in previous efforts.
Well, you've worked at numerous levels of government, whether it's New York City, Congress, and now at the state level. I've maintained there is something unique about New York State government. And when you try to bring in someone from the outside, they have a real learning curve. They have to take some lumps, so to speak, before they are successful. To what degree do you think Planet Albany is unique, like I'm talking about? Or do you think my thesis is garbage and, you know, it is kind of plug and play?
It's a really good question. I think certainly Albany is unique. I imagine every state capital has its own idiosyncrasies and particular characteristics. Albany being, I think the New York capital there's a level of intensity, the amount of money that gets spent on lobbying, on campaigns here for state office is probably, if not unique, certainly up there with California and a few other places. And there's a Byzantine political culture here. I remember some years ago talking to somebody about San Francisco politics, and they referred to this one guy as kind of the guy in San Francisco politics. And it occurred to me that there was no equivalent of that in New York because the political landscape was so complex and deep, and there are so many different interest groups and issues that compete with one another. And maybe there'd be a guy in industry or a specific issue area, but that there would be that one person who existed in San Francisco had 40 equivalents in New York, all of whom had some amount of political power. So I certainly think Albany and New York is unique and uniquely complex, probably as states and cities go. But I would also say that every political ecosystem is complex. I think one of the things that I've gotten pretty good at over the years is the ability to just find a way, to find a path, and no two political fights are going to be exactly the same. You always have to be a bit improvisational. You have to be willing and able to roll with the punches and figure out, okay, that didn't go exactly as I had planned. Let me go re-maneuver a bit.
Well, then sticking with the idea of political fights and the complicated nature of Albany, in a synopsis of the 2025 legislative session, you wrote on your Substack that you had focused on bills that, quote, would have as broad and as substantive an impact as possible. So because pushing local bills generally has less interested stakeholders, and so there's less parties that you have to please before you get it across the line, can you talk about the process of moving some of those broad substantive bills, whether it was 2025 or 2026, and all of the different stakeholders and ducks you had to get in a row to move them?
The biggest one in 2025 was that I was sponsoring was the Fair Business Practices Act, which was legislation that was the first significant expansion of our consumer protection law in 40 years. And to your earlier question, this was something that dated back to my time in the Attorney General's office more than a decade ago. I had asked my colleagues at the time, I was chief of staff in the office, what could be done legislatively that would make it easier for us in the Attorney General's office to fulfill our mandate of protecting New Yorkers? And the answer was strengthen the consumer protection law because it's surprisingly narrow. And that was something that we didn't get done back then. It was an issue that we picked up during my time in the governor's office, and it didn't get done in the 24 legislative session. I had left the governor's office right at the beginning of 2024, but it was an issue both during the budget and during the legislative session and fell short. And so the first thing that I had to do when I was elected to the Assembly was lobby to get control of that bill. That was a bill that had been carried by Helene Weinstein and then by Yulee New, and I wanted to be the sponsor of that bill. So first order of business was persuade the Speaker and the Speaker's staff to let me sponsor the bill. Worked with the Attorney General to freshen it up a bit. There were provisions and revisions that got added and made. And then we set about trying to get it through the legislature. And it encountered fierce opposition from the banking and insurance industries. It was, I believe, during the legislative session, the second most lobbied against bill in the legislative session. What we ultimately had to do to get it passed, it was a bill that both expanded the Attorney General's authority and expanded an existing but very narrow private right of action under the law. And ultimately, we had to jettison the expansion of the private right of action to be able to get it to the floor of the Assembly and of the Senate. And that happened literally in the final minutes and hours of the Senate being in session. In fact, it was added. The ice cream had already come out on the Senate side. What people thought was the last bill agenda had been issued. And when I thought we had our breakthrough on the bill, and I remember it was about midnight in the Capitol, I went over to the Senate. I saw Brad Hoylman Siegel, and I said, "Are they gonna do my bill? I think we're gonna do my bill." He said, "Micah, the ice cream's out. They put out the last agenda. They're not doing your bill." But as it turned out, we had succeeded in getting the breakthrough that I thought, and got it to the floor on the Senate, and got it voted on in the Assembly in the last final hours of our session as well.
Well, sticking with the legislative process, you've described this as less schoolhouse rock and more, quote, a mix of improvisational jazz and whack-a-mole. Can you elaborate on how it sometimes felt like that, and maybe an example of a bill trying to move it that embodied that colorful description?
Sure. Well, this is a good, the improvisational whack-a-mole is because the scales are so tilted in the direction of people that want to kill a bill. Mm-hmm. It's so much easier to kill legislation than it is to pass it. And the Albany way is try to piss off as few people as we can. Ideally, make everyone happy. Generally, my view is if everyone's happy, you probably haven't changed a thing. I still remember working for Mike Bloomberg, and there was a bill that was a good bill that I was up lobbying on. It was a transportation-related bill. And I remember sitting with a fairly senior member of the Assembly, and they said to me, "Well, if you can get everybody to agree, I think we might do it." And I just thought that was such a unintentionally funny description of Albany, right?
Who was that?
That day we'll leave on the cutting room floor.
It wasn't like David Gant, was it?
But it was such a commentary on this notion that, well, we don't have agency. We've delegated our agency to an array of special interest groups. And if you can achieve unanimity amongst those special interest groups, then we, in acts of great courage, will do their collective bidding. And that was a revelation to me. And that, to some extent, is a reality in Albany, that if you have any meaningful interest group that is trying to kill your bill, it's really hard. So part of the task is trying to go mollify all of the various interest groups while still trying to hold on to something as a legislative instrument that's going to make a difference. And that was very much the case with the Consumer Protection Bill. The messages that we had gotten from the folks trying to kill the bill were, well, the thing we hate about this bill is the private right of action expansion. And so I only ultimately grudgingly and with some great pain decided to jettison the expansion of the private right of action. And lo and behold, a lot of those groups all of a sudden had new things to complain about in the bill. And I remember saying to one of the lobbyists that was on the other side, this is, I've done the thing that people were saying needed to be done. This is a pretty good compromise. Wouldn't the reasonable thing be for you to take the compromise? And that person said to me, well, I think there's a school of thought that, if we can kill the bill, why wouldn't we just still try to kill the bill? And so that's the dynamic. And this year, I was very involved in the buffer zone legislation. I had introduced it as a standalone bill. It became a budget issue. And all of a sudden, there was opposition from groups who said it wasn't tough enough. I firmly expected opposition from the left, from a civil libertarian perspective. Never did I expect opposition from groups saying, well, it needs to be 100 feet, which was pretty clearly not going to pass constitutional muster. And all of a sudden, now I'm dealing not with a problem on our left, but a problem on our right. And now I'm having difficulty getting consensus support even from my Jewish colleagues in the state assembly. And that then became the challenge of the day to move that bill forward, which was completely not the challenge that I expected walking in the door on it.
Well, I want to come back to your career trajectory because during your congressional run, there was a lot of talk about how you'd long had dreams of succeeding Representative Nadler, who you previously worked for. Was there, though, any time in your career when you felt yourself moving away from that career path? Was there ever something, maybe professionally or personally, where you thought, no, this is going to be the identity of Micah Lasher, and that's going to be some other guy serving in Congress?
The answer is yes. It's a really good question. I think the clarity of vision and purpose that has been ascribed to me in this context dramatically overstates whatever clarity I ever had. And I think that's sort of natural, right? People in politics are ambitious by definition. You don't run for Congress if you're not ambitious. And so there's a tendency to assume that, people who are in my position have sort of had it all mapped out and have kind of stuck to a plan forever. But the reality is that number one, to this day, I have a somewhat ambivalent relationship with the process of running for office and with being a politician. And my interest and willingness to do that has ebbed and flowed over the years. I would say that the years that I spent in high level positions on the staff side of government have probably been the times when my interest in running has been at its lowest, because you're in this phase where you can have a real impact, where you can make change through government, where you can do the kind of problem solving that excites me without subjecting yourself to some of the less fun parts of actually standing for office and having your name on the door. Obviously, my family, I have a really I have a blessed life. I have 3 kids. We have a wonderful family life. I try to and enjoy spending time with my family, and there are real trade-offs there with being an elected official. So it's very much been an ebbing and flowing dynamic. And as for succeeding Jerry, that Jerry Nadler has been an icon in my political world since I got involved in politics. And I have watched now several generations of elected officials who were talked about as people that might be likely to succeed Congressman Nadler. And so there was something pretty humbling and wild about the fact that after all of these years, when this moment arrived, that I would have an opportunity to do that. And it obviously sets a very high bar for me going forward.
Well, prior to your last 2 successful election runs, you had an unsuccessful bid for state senate in 2016 in that crowded Democratic primary. And hopefully there's some Dispatches listeners who still remember the name Marcel Alcantara. But I'm curious, what campaign takeaways did you have from that unsuccessful run? And did that discourage you at all from potentially running for office again in the future?
It's a good question. It was actually, that was, I would say, the most fun of my 3 campaigns. I enjoyed that campaign the most.
It seemed like you almost had nothing to lose then.
It did. That's exactly right. It was a big district, and the focus of the campaign, the focus of my energies was in a part of the district that I didn't know very well. It's not my political base. The West Side was part of that district, or a chunk of the West Side. So there was nothing to lose. It was fun. It was spirited. It was a very diverse district. So you were getting to know lots of different parts of the borough. It was a good time. Lost by 300 votes. I learned something about myself, which was how I would deal with losing, which was something I didn't know heading into that race. I didn't know if I'd be devastated or what. And I wasn't. I was sad. I would have preferred a different outcome. My primary emotion was relief at it being over. And I was really glad I'd run, and kind of no regrets. And I wouldn't say it discouraged me from running for office, but I didn't come out itching to do it again. I certainly didn't come out ready to do it again. It was one of the reasons why I supported Robert Jackson in the following election. He and I had basically split the more progressive vote, and Marisol, who was running and ultimately joined the IDC, was able to squeak out a victory. And so I said to Robert, who was interested in running again, you should go do this and I'll support you. And so it didn't discourage me, but everything has a silver lining. I think as a result of losing, number one, I got a lot of years with my family without having to make the Albany commute. And I did a bunch of interesting things in the intervening years that made me better and smarter and more well-rounded, and brought me to this moment.
Well, since we're bringing up the IDC, which is a wonderful blast from the past, let's talk about the Senate Democrats more specifically and the first iteration of the Senate Democratic majority, because you were working in New York City at the time. You were director of the Office of State Legislative Affairs in 2010, which means you missed the Senate coup excitement to a certain degree. But what are your memories of that? No,
I didn't miss. I lived through the Senate coup.
Because of the issue with mayoral control, or what was your experience?
Yeah, I was working. The coup was spring of 09.
June
09,
8th,
right?
2009, the day before my birthday.
Yeah, and I was, at that time, director of legislative affairs for the city's Department of Education, but I was responsible for getting mayoral control of the schools reauthorized, which was the city's top legislative priority. So I was very much kind of part in a meaningful way of the mayor's legislative operation, even though I wasn't running it at that point. Michelle Goldstein was my friend and colleague, was running it at the time. So yeah, I was up here and I was desperately trying to get a really big thing done when everything turned sideways. So I remember that vividly. And, and the mayor was someone who, in that moment in time, the situation was so crazy and everybody was at such a loss for how to resolve it that I found myself, on behalf of the mayor, on the receiving end of various entreaties and ideas about how we and he might help, resolve the coup.
You could broker the peace.
Of course, in favor of whomever was making the entreaty. And it was self-evident that would be the just and right outcome at the time. What a bloody mess it all was.
Yeah, instead we get a leadership of John Sampson as a conference leader, Malcolm Smith, and some sort of title for Pedro Espada, and everybody came out of that looking just great.
Yeah, I have reflected on. It's obviously not a unique insight to observe the run of federal prosecutions that occurred in that era, but it's really remarkable to me the extent to which I and maybe others had just sort of accepted that as a norm. Like, that's just how it's going to be up here.
Pedro's going to be Pedro.
Yeah. And it's been notable that we've now had a good stretch of time without any federal indictments, at least at a high level. So I think Albany deserves a collective pat on the back for getting its house in order at least a little bit.
I'm curious, when you joined the Assembly, you're coming from the Hochul administration, were you bracing for any sort of icy reception given the natural tension between the branches of government as well as the governor's approaches to budgets, which are still rankling the legislature to some degree? So were you concerned about some light hazing? And I guess how ultimately were you received by your fellow Assembly Democrats?
It's a good question. I don't know that I was braced for light hazing, and I don't know that I really endured it. There definitely were moments. There definitely were moments when I found myself in substantive agreement with the governor, and would articulate that, and the assumption was, in effect, I was just doing her bidding, rather than I thought she was right on the merits. It's not animus. I think all things considered, the governor has a pretty good relationship with members of the legislature. But there is this real institutional tension, some of it obviously baked in to the structure of our government, and really that gets brought about during the budget process, that people feel, and a real difficulty of seeing the other side of seeing the perspective of the other side. I think it was an advantage to me, a helpful thing to me, to understand, not in a cynical way, but in kind of an earnest way, what the perspective was of the executive. When I worked for the governor, by the way, I think because of my time in different roles, I think I had a pretty good understanding of where the legislature was coming from in a way that was helpful. I think in the Assembly, I often found myself seeing the frustration that both my colleagues and the executive were feeling about a budget impasse in particular, which was often where it would come up, and seeing that there were valid perspectives on both sides.
Well, while you were in the Assembly, did you find yourselves gravitating toward any lawmakers in particular? Like, oh, this is the person I want to carry my bill in the Senate, or here's the person I want to have lunch with when I'm up in Albany. I mean, were there natural Michael Lasher friends and allies?
Well, I mean, Brad Hoylman-Siegel is one of my best friends in life, and we've been friends for 25 years, and his Senate district covered most of my Assembly district, so it was natural that he and I were going to do a lot of bills together and spend time together, and we did. I was pretty, in the Assembly.
Well, then hang on. How was it when he left? When he
abandoned
abandoned his boy?
I was very sad when he left, but I was happy for him that he had a new job as borough president, and Eric Botcher's been a great replacement for him. But Brad is somebody that I'm very personally close with, and definitely made coming to Albany a homier experience. In the Assembly, I was pretty cognizant of not wanting to have a clique. My ideal was somebody who could get along with everybody and work with people on different issues across ideological differences in background, differences in geography. That was always my goal. And so I was a little careful to not be seen as sort of part of a particular group.
Well, given your experience now in the Assembly and in the Hochul administration, where you're able to turn an idea into a new law or regulation in as short as a few months, and you're heading now to a place where things are basically gridlock in the best of times, are you mentally prepared for that? Are you level setting your expectations, or do you just medicate yourself once you join Washington?
Probably a bit of both.
Okay.
I think, yes, I am level setting. I think that the work of the next, hopefully we will have a Democratic majority in the House. Maybe we pull an inside straight, get a Democratic majority in the Senate. But I think the great likelihood is one way or another, we're still going to be dealing with Donald Trump in the White House. And so I am level setting about what's possible over the next few years. I think that the work of the next 2 years obviously is going to be very heavily about oversight and accountability for the Trump administration. And that is work that I hope to play a meaningful role in. On proactive legislation, I think for me, a lot of the work of the next 2 years will be building a legislative agenda and a legislative portfolio, and developing ideas, developing bills, figuring out what's viable, and hopefully setting the table for what might be a trifecta moment coming after the 28 presidential elections. That's so I am realistic about what's possible from a proactive legislating perspective over the next 2 years. Of course, I will seek out any opportunities, even small ones, to get things done on a bipartisan basis. But as I said often during the campaign, I think we shouldn't kid ourselves about the extent to which bipartisanship is not particularly alive and well in Washington.
Well, finally, I have to admit that I'm late to the game in this, but can I implore you to really be a constant poster of your Into the Weeds Substack once you officially take office, because while your posts are a little sporadic in the last 2 years.
I want them to be less sporadic.
Well, your synopsis of 2025 and your overview of how the legislative session works was great. So I really think that you need to take that same energy and bring it to D.C. and be a more reliable poster. Can we get that assurance?
I'm gonna. Yeah, you have my commitment to best efforts on that front,
okay.
And I hope to get out a few Albany-related posts between now and the end of the year. I am still a state assemblyman, and I'm not giving up that job until the end of the year. So and there's one that I'll preview for you.
Ooh.
I think it's a hot take. I think that a meaningful reform that would improve the effectiveness of the legislature without putting a thumb on the scale ideologically would be limits on bill introductions and bill co-sponsorships.
Oh, did you hear that noise? That was Linda Rosenthal getting in a car to come and find you and kill you.
No. Linda's a great legislator.
Well, unless you cap it at 500, you're going to kind of impact her routine.
No, it's the overall, the total volume of bills that, first of all, we pass a lot of bills that do very little, number one. Number two, we introduce just a massive number of bills, and co-sponsorships are doled out really as if they are in infinite supply.
Sure.
And in many cases, without regard to the merit of the bill that is being co-sponsored.
Who doesn't love a gold slip?
Yeah, who doesn't love a gold slip? But meanwhile, we are asked to submit a priority list of bills, right? So I think it's 15. We do. I think it's 5 and then 10. So at the end of the day, with some exceptions, by and large, you kind of know if your bill isn't one of the priority bills, it's probably not getting done. Certainly not if it's a bill of any consequence. Certainly not if it's a bill that's going to take floor time. And so if you're already having to do that triage work, why not just say, you don't need to introduce more than 25 bills a session, and you can't co-sponsor more. And by the way, this will also make co-sponsorships much more meaningful. Now, if there are 75 co-sponsors on a bill, in a world in which our co-sponsorships are rationed, then that has a lot more meaning than it does where very often members will co-sponsor a bill just to kind of get someone out of their office. So that's the summary of a Substack that is germinating in my mind.
I'll keep my eyes out for it.
All right.
Well, we've been speaking with Assemblymember Micah Lasher. He is a Upper West Side Democrat who will be heading to Congress in 2027. Assemblymember, thank you so much for making the time. Really appreciate it.
Glad to do it.
Micah and his wife, Elizabeth, live on the Upper West Side, 10 blocks from where he grew up, with their 3 children, Nate, Ben, and Phoebe. Please join me in welcoming Assemblymember Lasher to our chamber.